Now on Book TV, an encore presentation of C-SPAN's Q&A program. Author and Rolling Stone contributing editor Michael Hastings, who died in a car crash on June 18th, discussed his book, The Operators. The book expanded on the 2010 article Hastings wrote for Rolling Stone magazine that led to the forced resignation of General Stanley McChrystal. Michael Hastings told the story of how he was granted access to General McChrystal and his closest staff, and he recounted how he went about taking notes and recording conversations. This program originally aired on January 29, 2012, and it's about an hour.
This week on Q&A, author and Rolling Stone magazine contributing editor Michael Hastings discusses his new book, The Operators, the wild and terrifying inside story of America's war in Afghanistan.
Michael Hastings, why did you call the book The Operators?
The Operators is from what Special Forces soldiers call themselves. They call themselves Special Forces Operators. And so specifically, it refers to Special Forces, but I also thought that everyone who was involved in these conflicts, from diplomats to journalists to public relations people to aid workers, all had a bit of an operator in them, to people in the White House to people in the embassy in Afghanistan.
If you total up all the time you've spent in Iraq and in Afghanistan and the number of trips you made, what are the numbers?
A lot more time in Iraq than Afghanistan. For this book, I did 4 trips to Afghanistan. A good chunk of, I think I've spent 4 of my last 5 Christmases, or 4 of the last 6 Christmases in either Baghdad or Kabul, or right around that time. So it's been since 2005. It's been my life.
And you're how old?
I'm now 31. It's been a long decade. It's been a long decade, though.
Your college was what?
NYU, New York University.
New York University. Studied what?
Studied English. Got a degree that certified me to join the workforce. And I started actually at Newsweek as an unpaid intern my last semester at NYU, working for Fareed Zakaria as a Newsweek International, actually.
You say in your book that there are 27,000 working PR people in the Pentagon spending $4.7 billion a year. 27,000? Where do you get that number?
It's the number that includes, it's a broader number, not just sort of their propaganda folks, but advertising and everyone who's working on shaping the message that the Pentagon wants to put out there. It goes from software programs the Pentagon is now making that monitors our social media. For instance, there's been a recent example where the Army is using a program that monitors how many times Bradley Manning is mentioned. Bradley Manning, the WikiLeaks leaker, is mentioned on Twitter. It goes to the massive public relations apparatus that all branches of the military have. I mean, there are more, I've often thought about this, there are more public relations people on a general's staff in Kabul than there are reporters in Kabul, in Afghanistan.
Do you ever ask them why?
Well, they need all the help they can get, apparently, because even with this message machine, they haven't been able to put too positive a spin on this on occasion.
You say in your book, I hate this war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did you hate the Iraq war?
Yes, yeah.
Did you hate the Afghanistan war?
I learned to hate war in general. I mean, it would be very difficult for me, having been through a number of things with both these wars, to really be gung-ho about any conflict. I think, if someone's invading our country or you're invading your house, that's one thing, but this sort of adventurism, I have a very, very dark and dim view of it. It's made me, in my experience, all war does is destroy what we love. It destroys people, it destroys families, it destroys homes, it destroys your memories, and it's very dark. Now, the flip side of it is that there's this grand excitement to be involved in it. That's the operators. The operators, in a sort of sick and twisted way, love the war. I mean, I was talking to a State Department official recently, and he was recalling his time in Baghdad, and he in 2006, at the height of the sectarian violence, and he said it was magical, and And so there's all sorts of conflicting feelings one has, because when you're in these things, the stakes are as high as they're ever going to be. It's life and death. You feel like you're at the center of the history, and that's a very intoxicating feeling. Hence the cover of the book, where we have an illustrated picture of a general with a pistol in one hand and a Scotch glass in the other. And what that is intoxication.
Did you have a problem with your first publisher on this?
They had a problem with me. I think is probably the more accurate way to put it. Yeah, essentially what happened was I said I'm going to write a book that's going to push the envelope and be very controversial. They said that sounds great, and then I delivered that book, and they lost their nerve. Fortunately, I'm now with Blue Rider Press with my amazing editor, legendary editor David Rosenthal, who got the book, understood the book, and made the book much better in my opinion.
That's Penguin.
Penguin, yeah, Penguin Blue Rider Press,
which is a big publisher.
Oh yeah, no, they loved it, you know, and they were excited about it. And the publisher that Penguin, how should I put this without getting into some sort of legal trouble? Essentially, for this book, you needed a publisher who was going to be 110% behind you. You know, in this book, I write about some of the most powerful people in the country, and I write about them in not always in both a flattering and sometimes unflattering light. And if you're going to do that, you need to have the support of people who really believe in what you're doing. And I didn't have that at the previous publisher.
Who was that first publisher?
Little Brown. Yeah, it was disappointing to see, you know, this sort of I don't know what to call it, kind of gutlessness from them. But it worked out. I mean, it worked out better for me in the end because, like I said, David Rosenthal is the guy you want editing this book, and Penguin's the publisher you want.
What makes him so special?
He's worked with everybody. He's worked with you know, some of my idols. He's worked with Hunter S. Thompson, Richard Ben Kramer. He edited What It Takes. If there's his fingerprints are on a lot of the major American nonfiction works of the past 30 years. He always surprises me. He always will be sitting in his office and he'll tell me, "Oh, I edited this guy or that guy," and it happens to be my favorite books.
What, in your opinion, in this book is the farthest you went about anybody or anything that makes people nervous?
My guess would be the most uncomfortable aspect of the book for some people would be my depiction of General David Petraeus, who's been widely regarded as the hero of the Iraq War, and also in many ways a hero of Afghanistan, though he didn't sort of pull it off as well as he did. And I offer a very different picture from what one is accustomed to when you read about General Petraeus.
Like what? What do you say about him?
Well, I quote some of his colleagues talking about him, and the knock on General Petraeus from his colleagues. And now there's a lot of envy involved in this too, but I think there's also truth in it, is that whenever General Petraeus shows up and takes over an assignment, he makes everyone before him look like a total idiot. I use much stronger language in the book, quoting military officials. And this great quote from another general who describing General Petraeus' sort of tactic, which is that Petraeus leaves the dead dog on your doorstep every time. And that to me is a very powerful indictment of General Petraeus' record from Iraq, when he was responsible for equipping and arming the Iraqi police and army, which was a total disaster. And remember, these are the Iraqi police and army that ended up being the death squads. You know, to this strategy in Afghanistan, which was also, in my mind, a complete disaster.
But you know, you can see the person watching right now saying, that young punk. Mm-hmm. He's 31 years old. You've never served in the military.
Right.
What the heck do you know about counterinsurgency warfare or anything that has to do with the military?
I mean, I can just say that I report what I've seen and heard. I was the Newsweek Baghdad correspondent for 2 years. My younger brother was a Bronze Star winning infantry platoon leader. Some of my best friends are in the military. I personally suffered loss in these conflicts, and you know, it's interesting. And my experience was forged, you know, on the streets of Iraq during the worst sectarian fighting, seeing 3-star, 4-star, 2-star generals act totally clueless, act like clowns, totally ignoring the reality in front of them. And I saw it firsthand. I sat in on briefings every day while the guy with 2 stars on his shoulder, would tell us how great everything in Iraq was. Well, there were 3 car bombs waking me up every morning. So you know, I went down and interviewed this warlord in southern Afghanistan, a guy, a notorious human rights abuser and drug smuggler, who General David Petraeus has embraced. This is a guy, this drug smuggler, warlord is as we speak, torturing people himself with cigarettes. So, you know, I'm happy if people want to try to disparage me because I should be older or this or that. I would just say, well, you know, judge my work. If you don't like my work, you know, still buy a copy of the book.
Let me read you. This is the Wall Street Journal, and the review section is under the, I think, control of the editorial page, which is very conservative. And the author of this review is a guy named Mark Moyar, M-O-Y-A-R, who has written a book, A Question of Command, Counterinsurgency from the Civil War to Iraq. I just want to lay down the first paragraph and get you to put this in context. He says, Mr. Mark Moyar, writing about your book, during the Vietnam War, the generation of David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan transformed America's mainstream media into a hotbed of anti-war and anti-military muckraking. By the time a major war effort returned in 2003, that would be Iraq, that generation had grown too old to visit the trenches, allowing the emergence of Generation X reporters like Dexter Filkins and George Packer, who are both older than you are, both one writes for the New York Times, one writes for the New Yorker, who did not share their predecessors' contempt for the military. Most Americans welcomed the change. Not so for Michael Hastings, as we learn in The Operators, his account of events in Afghanistan from 2008 to 2011. Mr. Hastings asserts that this generational change drove him to write The Runaway General, the Rolling Stone article of June 2010 that doomed the career of General Stanley McChrystal. Anyway, put that in context. Is that true?
Well, first bit of context there, that the Wall Street Journal failed to disclose that the reviewer is a consultant for the U.S. military who's worked for General Petraeus and worked for General Caldwell. So the Wall Street Journal has chosen a military contractor who's worked for the people I criticize, who's taken a lot of money from them to review the book and didn't disclose it. So when we're talking about kind of journalistic ethics and I would exhibit A and what not to do.
How do you know that, by the way?
It's on his webpage. There's a counterinsurgency company employs him as a consultant. It's called like Orbis Communications. I forget the exact name. And I did write a letter to the Paul at the editorial page there, but he did not see fit to run my my letter pointing out their oversight. But I think that to me was sort of a really eye-opening review for a lot of reasons. And because I think he's right. I think there is a major difference between David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan and what George Packer and Dexter Filkins are doing. And I think it is generational. And I think, and this is what it is, Halberstam and Sheehan, and there were a number of other journalists, they were in their 20s in Vietnam. You know, they saw this stuff firsthand. They saw the disaster unfold firsthand. They got the lies fed to them firsthand. They saw the horrors of the war firsthand. And so when they came back, they were able to sort of decipher all the BS and get through the spin machine. David Halberstam calls it the great lying machine. And it was during the formative years when they were beginning to report. Packer and Filkins, on the other hand, essentially Packer made his career off cheerleading for the Iraq War. And Dexter, and look, Dexter's in great reporting. I mean, but I think it's very easy to get sucked into this military reporting culture where you give up a lot of your punch in order to keep riding along with the boys in the Humvee.
Now, in your book, you talk about a lot of people, including Dave Silverman, Duncan. There's some others I'll mention, but let me just start down the characters. And when did you start wanting to do the General McChrystal article? What was the first time somebody either suggested it to you or you went to them and asked for it?
Honestly, the first time I had the idea was in 2005 in Baghdad, and I said, wouldn't it be interesting to do an embed with General Casey? You know, wouldn't it be interesting to hang out in the command and kind of really get General George Casey, who was commander at the time.
Commander in Iraq.
Iraq at the time. I said, you know, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of get inside the command and do a kind of embed in the same way that we're accustomed to doing it with the troops, like with the grunt on the soldiers on the ground, like Ernie Pyle, and there's been a great tradition of this sort of first-hand reporting, capturing what, you know, Willie and Joe are saying on the ground, capturing their idiosyncrasies, how they really speak, their fears, their loves, their desires, all this sort of experience of war for these sort of low-level grunts, and that sort of seed sort of grew over the years. And I thought about trying to do a profile of General David Petraeus. I would end up doing it anyway. And then I saw that General McChrystal was getting quite a bit of very, very interesting coverage. And I just sensed there was a bigger story there, just sort of reading between the lines of some of the other profiles. So that's what I wanted to do. I mean, Generation Kill, one of my models, other book by a Rolling Stone writer, that was one of my models, right? To try to do what Generation Kill did to the Marines and the Humvee, to try to kind of capture that with the highest command.
Who wrote that?
Evan Wright. Evan Wright.
So go back again to the beginning. Who'd you call first?
The first person I called, I sent an email to Duncan Boothby, who's one of the characters in the book, who is General McChrystal's civilian public relations advisor, as well as two other public affairs people.
Who were they?
Colonel Wayne Shanks was one of the guys, and I think I sent an email to another Admiral Smith.
Admiral Smith, Greg Smith?
Yeah.
So what did you ask him?
I said, I'd love to do a profile of General McChrystal. We're coming up on the year, a year you've been in command, and you know, any access you could give me would be great, and we'll, you know, to assess the situation in Afghanistan.
Now, did they know your background at Newsweek?
I'm not sure exactly how familiar they were with my work. I mean, I know that I did not expect to get any access, actually. I really didn't. I just sort of, whenever you're doing a story on anything, you always make the call and you always ask.
But you're coming at them from Rolling Stone magazine, which define that.
Rolling Stone has 40 years of, you know, kicking, I'm trying not to swear. Rolling Stone's have 40 years of rock and roll kind of style journalism, you know, no holds bars, kick down the doors, you know, toss the hand grenade, expose the powerful, sort of journalism. I mean,
owned by Jan Wenner.
Jan Wenner, one of the great, you know, legends in publishing, and someone who's, you know, supported me 110% incredibly.
And so, what year was this?
When they founded it?
No. When you approached them.
Oh, 2010.
So you're talking, you're in their 20s then.
Yeah. April. This all happened in April 2010. I think in February, around February or March, I went to the Rolling Stone offices, met with Will Dana and Eric Bates, pitched them the story, and then Then I went back to Baghdad, and then I got an email when I was in Baghdad covering the elections from Eric Bates, and he said, "Hey, you know, write up a more detailed pitch of the McChrystal story." I did so, and then got in touch with McChrystal's people and went back to Vermont, and then over to meet them in Paris.
We're in the early part of 2012, and this was in 2010.
Right.
How long from the time you got this idea till the time that General McChrystal was dismissed from the Army?
I met up with probably 3 months. It's about a 3-month period.
Why did they let you in?
Well, I think the strategy, this actually gets to the public relations strategy that General Petraeus had pioneered. And it's something I call it Petraeus envy. All these other generals in General Petraeus' generation are trying to do what General Petraeus did so well, which is to build up a kind of fan base in the media which operates as a separate power structure to bypass the sort of traditional chain of command, which gives General Petraeus a lot of influence. So General Petraeus has been profiled by everybody. He's been on the covers of everything. And other generals look at that and say, wow, he plays this media game so well, and look at all the advantages it gets him. He can kind of do what he wants, and he can push whatever agenda or policy that he wants to push. So I believe there was an attempt to create this sort of same sort of cult-like or hero status for General McChrystal, which would then also allow General McChrystal to get away with more, to push his own policies, and to create a separate sort of power base within the media.
Why does he want to do that?
Because then you can, if he has, I mean, the concrete example happened during the Afghanistan strategic review when McChrystal and Petraeus actually used the media, used strategic leaks to the media to get the number of troops they really wanted.
When in the mix of all this did the 60 Minutes profile come out on General McChrystal?
Right in the middle of the beginning of the controversy over the strategic review. There was a very concerted campaign waged by friendly journalists, friendly think tankers who had worked for McChrystal just recently, and they all were sort of pushing this idea all at the same time. It was a very concerted, deliberate, and conscious campaign.
Give us 30 seconds of where General McChrystal had come from. I know you start out by saying he was at the West Point in the academy.
Right. General McChrystal started at West Point. His father was a general. Was kind of had a wild man reputation. Went into the Rangers and the Special Forces community as he went through his career, and then over the last decade, the War on Terror decade, McChrystal played one of the, if not the most pivotal role in this worldwide counterterrorism operation that the United States was running, called JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command.
When did he get the 4 stars?
He got the 4 stars right after he got the job in Afghanistan in June 2009.
And before that, right before he went there, where was he?
He was working for Admiral Mullen at the Pentagon on the Joint Staff.
So he's connected at the top.
He's super connected. He was connected in the previous administration with Rumsfeld and Cheney, and he was also Admiral Mullen. He was one of Admiral Mullen's sort of proteges. Admiral Mullen, in fact, introduced him to Mayor Mike Bloomberg, which gives a sort of sense of this world these guys are operating in, right?
But you say in your book that he's a Democrat.
He's a Democrat. He voted for Obama. He's liberal, I think, on social issues as well. They famously, General McChrystal famously didn't have Fox News in his headquarters. Usually, when you go to the military headquarters, they have these TV screens and they'd have Fox News on. General McChrystal did not have Fox News on.
You also say that who's this fellow, Dave Silverman?
Dave Silverman is quite a character, a Navy SEAL who became one of General McChrystal's sort of most trusted right-hand men, and very dynamic guy, very interesting guy, very entertaining guy, very accomplished individual. And in fact now, and Dave had a great time kind of hanging out with him on this trip. And now Dave Silverman is the CEO of the McChrystal Group, which is General McChrystal's consulting firm he set up, and he put Dave in as the CEO. And
you say in your book, and I've seen other places, that he's on the Navstar board, he's on the Siemens board, he's on what other?
JetBlue. He's offering training seminars for, I think it's $4,700 for 2 days.
Even though he was dismissed, he got along pretty well after he got out.
He reportedly gets $60,000 of speaking engagement, and he has a book coming out as well.
But go back to that moment when they said yes to you. Who said yes that you could come inside?
I got the email back from Duncan Boothby and Duncan said, "Why don't you come over to Paris, where General McChrystal was going to drum up support for among the NATO allies for the war." So yeah, so Duncan emails me, and I emailed my editor and said, "Hey, and Duncan called on the phone as well." And I said, "Yeah, can I go to Paris?" And my editor said, "Yeah, get on the plane." And so by April 15th, I had arrived in Paris.
2010.
April 15th, 2010, I had arrived in Paris, walked into the hotel room, the hotel lobby, met General McChrystal for the first time, and he looked at me and he said, "So you're the Rolling Stone guy. I don't care about the article. I just want to be on the cover." I said, "Well, sir, I think it's between you and Lady Gaga." I was just trying to make some joke, not knowing Lady Gaga was actually going to be on the cover. General McChrystal replied, "Just put me and Lady Gaga in a heart-shaped tub." And I thought, this is a different kind of general. This is going to be a different kind of story.
So what happened next?
What happened next? We went to the Arc de Triomphe, had kind of a non-event, and then the key moment came the next morning. On the first briefing I sat in on in the hotel room. And that was the briefing where General McChrystal, at the end of the briefing, started kind of making fun of Vice President Biden. He said, "Vice President Biden, who's that?" And then one of his other top close confidants said what had became the kind of most widely quoted piece in the story, "Biden, did you say bite me?" And everybody laughed. And this was in a briefing I was attending in front of, 10, 15 staffers, and I was and again I was like, wow, this is an interesting bunch of guys, and how they're talking about the civilian leadership.
Did they ever say to you, and I think this review implies, did they ever say to you, this is off the record, you cannot write about this?
2 times General McChrystal asked me to keep stuff off the record.
And did you?
Yes, yeah, and I say this in the book, I've honored that agreement. Their general attitude was, you know, it's kind of freewheeling style, we're not going to tell you what to write, you know, kind of go for it. And so it's been interesting to see the response that General McChrystal and his allies have had, right? I've been absolutely consistent from the minute the story broke to now, explaining what happened. Where General McChrystal and his allies have changed their story a number of times. First, they apologized for their behavior represented in the story, for the behavior reported in the story. Then they said, oh, I overstepped ground rules, but they could never really define where that was or what I was doing, and they sort of started lying to the Washington Post and other outlets about it, kind of just making stuff up. And then when then there were 2 subsequent Pentagon investigations into the story, they all of a sudden lost their memory and couldn't. They couldn't remember who said what, but everything that I reported was confirmed. It's just they couldn't remember who said it. So there was they've changed their story multiple times, and this is a new version that the Wall Street Journal guy trots out as well. That I was, you know, represented myself as some gung ho for the war, which is absurd.
You never implied to them that you were gung ho for the war.
No.
Did you ever imply to them that you were not gung ho?
I told Dave Silverman I hate war. I mean, I have it on a recorded interview. You know, I mean, and one of the funny things about it is when these guys General McChrystal and his staff have had these sort of memory lapses. Like, guys, I was the one taking notes. Remember, like I remember what was said. But on the other hand, you know, look, it was a big, you know, I think General McChrystal, from what I understand from people close to him, felt embarrassed by the whole thing. I think his staff felt embarrassed. So they have to push back. And it's not uncommon if you write a hard-hitting story or a story where people regret what they said to you, for them to either deny, evade, disavow what you just reported for various reasons. So it wasn't uncommon.
Did you set out to get General McChrystal?
No. I set out to write honestly about the war and put my viewpoint about the war out there. And you know, one of the strange things about it is, and why I didn't think I was going to get any access, because I've written numerous critical stories of the war in Afghanistan that are readily available. An entire critical book about Iraq. I've been on the radio talking about my views on the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq way before I had ever met them in Paris.
What's your general view of the military?
I think the military obviously is necessary. I think there's a lot of great people in it doing an amazing job. A really, really difficult job. I think it's way too big. I think it's bloated. I think often we give the military a pass on a lot of things because of various, you know, guilt left over from Vietnam and our own guilt, for not serving ourselves. But look, there's a lot of heroes in the military, and there are a lot of people who are much less than heroes. It reminds me of the Paul, I'm going to mispronounce his name, Paul Fussell quote. We did what he was talking about, the greatest generation, and he said something like, you know, there are a lot of drunks, you know, kooks and villains in the greatest generation as well. And that's to me, and then that was a total paraphrase, not an accurate quote, but that's the idea, right? That what I'm opposed to is mythologizing, you know, the military, and that I think upsets people. But again, you know, I've spent some of the most formative experience of my life have been with members of the military in these situations, and I honestly, I don't think I've ever any of the people who fought in these wars who I've spoken to and who've reached out to me, they've never criticized my reporting. In fact, a lot of them have said to me, and this is self-serving for me to say, but I'll say it anyway. A lot of them have said to me, you know, this is what it's really like, and that to me is the greatest compliment. If the brass is upset And if these think tankers in Washington are upset, then I feel like I've probably done my job.
How long were you allowed to hang around the general and his staff?
It off and on for a month from Paris, Berlin, Kabul, Kandahar, and then back to Washington.
And you got to hear them in their intimate conversations about everything?
Yes, yes.
And there was no restriction against you writing any of that down?
They did not. They did not put out any restrictions about that. And in fact, later I would have this sort of exchange with Duncan, the press guy, about this, the other sort of kind of moment in the story where there's this great bash, this huge party in Paris, where Duncan would come to me and say, 2 months later, oh, by the way, remember that the night in Paris, that was sort of off the record, which is like being, slightly pregnant. I mean,
they were clearly worried about it.
Yeah, they were very worried about it. They were very worried about it.
What else did General McChrystal say in your presence, or any of his staff, that caused him trouble with the President of the United States?
There was the Biden comment. That was the major one. Criticism towards General Jones. Also,
General Jones is who?
Was the National Security Advisor to President Obama, who McChrystal had.
There's some very rough things in your book about General Jones. Who was saying, and what were they saying about him?
The White House was not fans of General Jones. General Jones was an outsider coming into the Obama White House, and he didn't mesh with the Obama National Security team at all.
But they brought him in.
They did bring him in, and the reason they brought him in was because President Obama, or the idea was to show here's a bipartisan, serious national security pick, which they felt, for a young president with no military experience, it was important to have not just campaign people in that inner circle. It's interesting now the president has in fact gone away from that, and his national security team are his kind of closest advisors.
Now, General Jones was a 4-star Marine.
Yes.
Did you? What did the other military people that you were around say about him?
Well, McChrystal's people, they did not like General Jones at all.
Why?
As Dave Silverman said, he was a clown, stuck in NATO, didn't understand what they were doing.
How could you call a 4-star general a clown?
I think it's. I mean, I probably called the 4-star general a clown in this interview.
But I don't mean you. I mean, it's easy for people outside of the military.
Sure.
But you're in the. Dave Silverman was a lieutenant commander in the Navy.
Yeah, Navy SEAL. Well, I think this is the attitude of to be a Navy SEAL, you have to assume such a huge amount of risk, and your whole life is one giant gamble. You're jumping out of planes, deep sea diving, the craziest stuff you don't have at Navy SEALs. So it breeds an attitude, this sort of special forces, sort of the operators kind of attitude of a kind of cavalier disrespect for authority. And there's a lot of tension between the special forces community and the regular military over this sort of issues of attitude and kind of demeanor.
Here you are on April the 6th, 2011, about a year ago. Let's watch.
One of the reasons I was shocked by the response, and still am, is that I've been covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for 5 years, and usually no one cares about anything you write. And I don't even mean that ironically. It's just like there's jaw-dropping stuff that comes out every week about what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan that leaves nary a dent in our public consciousness. So my thinking at the time was, I knew it was good material, but my thinking was, well, maybe they'll talk about it on cable for a couple hours, and and then I'll go on my merry way and write a book about my time with the crazy general.
Now that is at the George Polk Awards, and every time your name is now mentioned in the press, Polk Award-winning journalist Michael Hastings, probably 999 people out of 1,000 don't have any idea who George Polk was or the award. Why is that so important?
For me, it was a great honor. The Polk Award is one of the most prestigious awards given to journalists, investigative journalists, and so by them giving me that award, gave the sort of stamp of approval for the sort of journalism I did. I think Seymour Hersh at the New Yorker has about 4 Polk Awards. Carl Bernstein's run Polk Awards. There's been a lot of great journalists who I admire who've won them before.
Is it fair to say that the Polk Award winners are usually liberal journalists?
Probably. I mean, most journalists I know are liberal.
Activist journalists.
I
I mean, activist people. Would you consider yourself an activist?
I think I think any journalist worth his salt has often has a real moralistic kind of righteousness to them somewhere in their soul, and I think that's you know, we're going to protect and we talk in grand terms about ourselves of, you know, afflicting the powerful and comforting the afflicted.
Where's your home originally?
I live in Vermont now.
But where were you
Originally
raised?
upstate New York, and moved around a lot when I grew up.
And what was the family like?
Family was great.
I mean, what did your parents do?
Parents are doctors. I have a younger brother and an older brother. I said my younger brother was in the infantry. Now he's in med school. My older brother is also in med school.
Both your mother and father were doctors? Mm-hmm. Are doctors?
Are doctors, yep.
What kind of doctors?
My mom's a ophthalmologist, and my dad's a cardiologist.
They have political points of view?
Yes, definitely.
Same as yours?
No. My dad has traditionally been a conservative or a Republican, and my mom has been traditionally a Democrat, though though the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have sort of pushed her towards the Ralph Nader, Ron Paul wing of there's not a wing in the Democratic Party for it anymore.
Where did you get your intellectual start? I mean, where did you start thinking strongly about war or views and things like that?
Well, when I was about 5 years old, my dad would go to this Army surplus store in the town of North Bangor, which is about 10 miles from the Canadian border, in upstate New York. And I remember, you know, I bought you know, Army flak jacket and helmets, and you know, I started, and then we actually moved to Montreal in Canada for a couple of years. I remember being in 7th grade, and I actually had become obsessed with the Vietnam War, and I would argue to all my classmates that, you know, America really won the Vietnam War at the time, you know. And I remember supporting George H.W. Bush in 1992. I guess I was 12 years old. I was a very active 7th grader, you know, campaigning, you know, on H.W.'s behalf, and sort of, you know, telling my friends about you know, Vietnam and this and that. And then, you know, as I moved into a teenager, I still became fascinated. I became fascinated by a lot of the beat drug literature sort of material. And then, you know, as I had to get a job and wanted to write, I knew I wanted to write from a pretty young age. This was you know, war again became something I was just sort of fascinated by, and I felt these were the biggest stories. Iraq was the biggest story of my generation. And I mean, I think Neil Sheehan said it, you know, his advice to young journalists is find the biggest story and grab onto it.
Well, explain this at the event, I think it's the same event, with, you're being interviewed by John Darton, mm-hmm. who used to be a New York Times reporter mm-hmm. for years, and a well-known reporter. Mm-hmm. There seems to be a tension here. Let's run this and explain this, because he's establishment, I guess, and you're not, but explain this.
I don't mean this to be a contentious question, but do you think, I mean, obviously your piece has created some controversy among your colleagues. Mm-hmm. Do you think it is fair to hang out with somebody over a long period of time, or even a short period of time, and kind of, you know, go drinking with them, listen to them?
I didn't drink with them.
Okay, go.
I don't.
Go to a bar
drink,
in which
actually.
they're getting hammered. And
have you read Rolling Stone?
Yeah. No, and hang out with somebody and kind of hear their kind of off-the-cuff comments.
There weren't off-the-cuff comments.
I'm not saying that they're
I'm going to contest every inaccurate thing you say, so let's just,
all right. Jokes. And I'm not saying they're irrelevant jokes, but mm-hmm. just comments, things people say. That, you know, banter among them. No, but let me finish. Do you think it's fair to take
I've heard this before. That's why I can know where you're going.
And weave it into a kind of larger portrait.
What was going on there?
I mean, that's the first time I've watched that exchange. I remember as it was going on, thinking like, "Wow, this guy is a real piece of work." What's going on there? It's a good question. I mean, it's a really interesting question. Essentially, a journalist from the New York Times is asking me, when you're writing a profile, should you try to capture the moments that reveal the people you're writing about's character? That's what he's asking me. You know, I mean, it took him 20 minutes to get to but that's the question. And my response is, as a profile writer, as someone who's trying to get at who these people are as characters, those off-the-cuff comments, those unguarded moments are what you're going for as a journalist and as a writer. The other point on the quote-unquote off-the-cuff comments is that those comments represented an attitude, a cultural attitude and climate of command in General McChrystal's staff, which was that of being contemptuous toward their civilian masters. And the reason why that's significant is because that actually had real policy implications. Their contempt to their civilians set up the situation where they felt no compunction to essentially disobey what the president had asked them to do. The president had said, I do not want a decade-long nation-building commitment in Afghanistan. General McChrystal, General David Petraeus gave the president a plan for a decade-long nation-building commitment in Afghanistan. And even recently, General McChrystal said, we're only 50% there in Afghanistan. 10 more years. A direct slap at the White House, yet again. I've been, at first, sort of the response, that sort of response to the gentleman there was somewhat perplexing, and I was like, oh, they just don't get it, you know. But then I realized there was something much sort of larger at work, and it wasn't about me, and it wasn't about Rolling Stone. It's about the nature of reporting on the military. When we call it the Pentagon Press Corps, you'd think, oh, it's this group that covers the Pentagon in this sort of watchdog role. But in fact, it's not. It's an extension of the Pentagon, who's promoting the Pentagon as much as any PR firm would. Though I think you get paid more at the PR firm. So for my friends over in the Pentagon, you know, you might want to look into that.
How concerned are you that in the future, when you want to do a profile on somebody, the doors will be closed to you?
I'm not concerned at all.
Why not?
Because I think if you're really dedicated to reporting, you find a way to get the story. You find a way to get the story.
Once they knew that this story was going to run in Rolling Stone, I mean they, meaning the people around General McChrystal, how tense was it?
I had already been back. I was back in Vermont, and I know Duncan had told people, Duncan, the press advisor, had said to people, this story's either going to be fun or it's going to end my career, and meaning Duncan's career.
Did it?
He lost his job. Yeah, he resigned.
And he was a civilian.
He was a civilian. And I've said this publicly before, and I've said this since it happened. I think Duncan sort of took a lot of the blame, when in fact I think, there was plenty. If people want to blame or take responsibility for it, there was plenty to share.
Who else should take some responsibility?
Admiral Smith was in the room for all these comments. This is a big time public affairs guy. And I think at the end of the day, and General McChrystal, to his credit, knows this. At the end of the day, it was General McChrystal's command. I mean, he was the guy. He was setting the tone for the entire bunch of guys. General McChrystal is the ultimate operator, and he set the tone for the rest of the operators that ran with him.
But were there any fact checking that went on from Rolling Stone to the military as this article got closer?
Yes, yeah. Rolling Stone does extensive fact checking. It's one of the few magazines left that actually does real extensive, very, very extensive.
So they were reading quotes back to them?
No. They didn't read quotes back to them. That we usually wouldn't do.
So where were you when the article, I know you're right about this, but where were you when the article was actually first exposed to a public?
Sure, I was in Kandahar working on a story about helicopter pilots, combat helicopter pilots. And in fact, I just arrived in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan. And unlike, usually a story comes out when the magazine decides to release it and it goes up on the internet or it's on the newsstand. In this case, a copy of the PDF of the story was leaked to the Associated Press. The Associated Press ran with an item from the story, and then it snowballed from there. So before Rolling Stone put the story up on its website, I think on Tuesday. But General McChrystal had already lost his job before the magazine actually arrived on newsstands.
What happened to you when you were there in the middle of this when the story came out?
It was a very intense experience. I was on the phone for 14 hours doing 14-hour length doing radio interviews, trying to get the story on the helicopter pilots. Went on a mission with the helicopter pilots while all this stuff was going on, and watched the sort of gun battle that went on between Taliban and American forces on the ground. I got the story, and essentially I agreed with the public affairs people in Kandahar that it was probably time for me to get out of Kandahar and go back to Kabul and eventually to the United States. So it was a very intense experience for me, and very strange. You know, we got rocketed in Kandahar. I'm trying to write a blog post about General Petraeus, and rockets come in and knock the power out. I got on the first military flight. Usually it's really hard to get on a military flight, especially as a journalist. You have to wait around. This was pretty easy. They put me on the flight pretty quickly, and all these soldiers had copies printed out of the story. I'd never seen anything like it.
And what was? How did they treat you?
Treated me well. They treated me well. They've almost everyone. There are a few exceptions, but most people in the military have always treated me with respect.
What would you tell somebody that wanted to do the same thing you've done? I mean, what should they expect? Talk some more about the reporters in the establishment press and whether or not are they handmaidens of the military?
Some probably are. I mean, not some. Some are.
What about John Burns?
John Burns
of the New York Times.
John Burns of the New York Times came out after my story was released and said that I had permanently damaged the relationship between the media and the military. Personally, I think in that case, that was John Burns. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. I mean, this is a serious guy. I mean, when John Burns comes out and attacks your work, it's not something you can. It's not something one takes very lightly, because it's like, wow, you know, this is a pretty serious man saying this serious thing.
What does he think you've done wrong?
Well, it's interesting. I've learned subsequently that Burns had hung around generals before and had heard some very newsworthy things and didn't report them. First, he wrote the blog about this in 2004 with General George Casey. He wrote a blog post where he said that General Casey said in 2004, do you think we can win in Iraq? Expressing doubts about the Iraq war. And John Burns didn't report it. So John Burns had the commanding general of Iraq expressing grave doubts about the war and did not report it. And Casey stayed in command for 18 more months.
You know that for sure?
Yeah, he wrote it in the New York Times.
Oh, okay.
So and then another instance, which I've been told, Burns was hanging out with General Petraeus, and Petraeus said, I should quit. And this I guess was in Baghdad, and Burns didn't report that either. And so I think he had his own sort of anxieties about why he didn't do this.
You on this at the same time talked about the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and I want to run that clip and again talk about how you see journalists relating to people in power.
Mm-hmm.
Look, Rolling Stone has, they've been, in my view, they've been doing great stuff with Matt Taibbi, Tim Dickinson, and a number of other journalists I could list off. And one of their functions is to not have to worry about things like that. Like we're able to go there because we don't have a table at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, you know? But I think also one of the things is that I talk to people at the Pentagon all the time still, you know, and they talk to me, not sometimes because they want to, not because they like me or like my socks, you know. They talk to me because they know it's in their interest to say, okay, we better, it's that Hastings guy, we better, you know, respond to his email, even if it's just to tell him to go have a nice day.
You mentioned the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and the reason I bring that up is we cover it all the time in this town, and you've never been?
No.
No. Would you go?
Probably. just because I mean, it would be tough. Would I go? I mean, that's a great question. I don't know. I mean,
what do you think happens?
My instinct as a journalist is always to go see something I haven't seen before, but that also is counterbalanced by there's something I've never been too comfortable with in Washington. I've lived here twice now, and I just don't get into that scene as I probably I just don't get into that scene.
You mentioned Matt Taibbi with Rolling Stone. His father works for NBC.
Yes. Yeah.
Is this a generational thing we're seeing happen between your generation and people that are a lot older?
I think I mean, Matt's incredible. The reason I wanted to write, one of the main reasons I wanted to write for Rolling Stone was because Matt was there, and I felt Matt was doing incredible work. And I said Tim Dickinson and a number of other journalists there. I think there's a generational, I think there's a generational split in journalism and across the media as well. And it can be divided in between those who get it and those who don't.
And what is it you're getting that the others don't?
Well, I think it's this is sort of off the topic of the book, but in my view, I have witnessed a number of major media figures who were taken totally by surprise by the social media, by the internet, by the sort of rapid change in the media landscape, and they've never and they don't know how to adapt to it, and they failed to adapt again and again and again and again. And I witnessed this firsthand. I witnessed Newsweek go from having 26 foreign correspondents there when I started, when I was 22, to being sold for a dollar and having maybe 2 foreign correspondents. I've witnessed serious failures to understand the landscape. So I think you have that side of things. And then I think in terms of actual reporting, I think a guy like, someone like myself, you know, or Matt I think does this, and as I try to, you know, like I said, I respect his writing greatly, pushing the envelope further. What can you say? How can you say it? How can you say it in a way that you're going to get people to read it, that's accurate? Because the great thing about Matt's reporting, the great thing about Rolling Stone's reporting in general, is that it's reporting. You know, it's not a mystery. You know, all these the magazines, oh, we need to do more opinion, we need to do more think piece, we need to do more of this. Rolling Stone is invested in its reporting, and it pays off. So, and Matt's criticisms and humor is based in his reporting. Is where I think the reason I can even write a book like this is because the reporting is solid.
You wrote a book a couple years ago about a woman that you lost in Iraq. Girlfriend?
Yes.
And when did she die, and how did she die?
She died on January 17th, 2007. She was working for the National Democratic Institute in Baghdad, and she was ambushed. Her convoy was ambushed while she was leaving the Iraqi Islamic Party headquarters, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq took responsibility for it. As a side note, recently in Iraq, Tariq al-Hashemi, the vice president, there's an arrest warrant out for him for connection to terrorist group. It's Hashemi's group that was involved in her killing.
What do you, how'd that first book go?
I wrote it I was so screwed up when I wrote that book. I wrote it was a love letter to her. It was my final love letter. I felt it was my best way I could honor her. I was angry. I was really angry, and it was raw, and it was angry. And it was about young love. It was about being in a relationship in your 20s at this sort of very strange time and having this very unique relationship where the person you are in love with decides to come over to Baghdad and join you and take a job there.
You've since married?
Yes. I'm pretty fortunate.
Where did you meet this person?
She had also actually been in Iraq, and my aunt and uncle, her roommate at college are best friends with my aunt and uncle, and they said, oh, you have to meet this girl. She just came back from Iraq working for the government, and they introduced us in Washington, D.C., but it was years before we started seeing each other.
How long have you been married?
You're putting me on the spot here. I got married in May. So
is it hard for somebody that like your wife to go back and read this book about this woman that was killed over in Iraq?
We don't really talk about it. My wife is an amazing woman, and you know, she understands that that's part of my life, you know, and it's a part of my life that made me who I am today, and I feel very fortunate that I was able to find someone else who who loved me as much as she does, and that I was able to love her again. I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to be in a relationship again after that.
Did she read the book, by the way, your wife?
Yes, before, but just when we were friends.
So, what's, you know, people, I mean, you say it yourself, some of the journalists today blame you for the relationship with the journalists and the future with the military. Do you think that's accurate?
I think that's nonsense. I think it's overblown kind of talk. And the other thing I would say, well, what has our great relationship with the military gained us over the past few years? And I would say not very much, you know. But I think this idea that, oh, you know, media military relationship, you know, is destroyed because of a Rolling Stone story is pretty crazy. The other thing, I think, if it's in a healthy world or a healthy democracy, you know, you'd probably want the media and the military's relation to be strained. You know, I mean, again, the deck is stacked against us. As you know, 27,000, you know, Pentagon employees working on this, $4.6 billion, and what's the budget of all the Kabul bureaus? What's the budget of all the Baghdad bureaus? It's dwarfed. It's dwarfed by what the Pentagon message machine is pushing out. Dwarfs all the reporters.
Let me ask you: have we been able? Do we know, as Americans, reading the American media or any media, what actually has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan?
I think actually we do. I mean, this is where I think the guys on the ground generally do a pretty good job, and have done an amazing job in very difficult circumstances to get the story. And if you're reading the New York Times, Washington Post, New Yorker, Time, Newsweek, you get a sense. Wall Street Journal, you get a sense of what's not their editorial page, but if you read their actual reporting, you get a sense of what's going on, a pretty good sense.
What would you say to a young person, again, we talked about this earlier, that wants to do what you've done? What do you need besides the...
Buckle up.
And what's that mean?
I think, look, I think as young, I don't think you can ever, you know, it's funny, when people talk about Michael Hare's dispatches, and there's this whole, who's going to write the next dispatches? This is this sort of debate within these circles. And you can't do that,
You're
right?
talking about Michael Hare?
Michael Hare, the...
New Yorker, was he New Yorker?
Esquire,
yeah,
and
who wrote Dispatches.
Wrote Dispatches.
In Vietnam.
Vietnam, yeah, exactly. It's a book about Vietnam. It's the classic. It's the book that all war correspondents love. And there's this sort of always this talk about, oh, you know, who's going to write the next dispatches? And my view on it is, you don't write the next dispatches. You do something original. You do something, you know, new, and that's what you're going for. So what I would say to any young reporter would be to, you know, go to the big story, always report the hell out of it, and find your own voice, and that's the key.
In this Wall Street Journal Mark Moyer piece, you say Mr. Moyer has actually worked for the military.
Yes, he's a consultant.
Near the end of the piece of the review, and the date on the review, by the way, was January the 5th, he writes, like David Halberstam and Neil Shin, Mr. Hastings ignores the harm that his reporting caused to America's overseas interests. The firing of General McChrystal removed the one American who enjoyed the confidence of Afghan President Hamid Karzai, and if Ashfaq Parvez Ghayani, I'm not sure.
Who's the general in
Chief
Pakistan.
of Staff in Pakistan.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to that? You've harmed this situation.
It's revisionist history. President Karzai threatened to join the Taliban twice while McChrystal was in charge. Threatened to join the Taliban, our enemy. Excuse me. And not only that, President Karzai rejected McChrystal's proposal, rejected his strategy, and there weren't. You can't really point to anything concrete about what McChrystal's relationship actually gained from Karzai. There's nothing they can point to that's concrete. It's just this kind of, oh, McChrystal got along with him and he was his buddy. Well, you know, what did it get us? Nothing.
The book is called The Operators, and the subtitle is The Wild and Terrifying Inside Story of America's War in Afghanistan. And our guest is Michael Hastings. We thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.